Hey everyone, and welcome to episode number 3 of my Drawing for the Total Beginner series. If you haven't checked out the first 2 episodes, I would highly recommend doing so. I'll make sure to link to them down below. In episode number 1, I explained everything that you should know about basic drawing supplies. I provided some of my favorite brands, I explained all about different drawing pencil grades and how they work, and I also answered questions such as how to sharpen drawing pencils, how to clean blending stumps, etc. In episode number 2, I talk about my drawing setup. I explain why it's so important to practice your drawing on a slanted or tilted surface. I explain about different ways to hold your pencil for drawing, and I provide exercises that will help you get comfortable moving your entire arm as you're drawing. In this episode, we're talking about how to simplify subject matter into basic shapes so that you can improve your overall shapes and your proportions when drawing or sketching freehand. In the first part of today's video, I explain essential information that you should be aware of so that you can improve your drawing skills faster. And then we move on to drawing different objects, both man-made and organic, and even simple nature scenes together. Stay tuned for the next 2 episodes in this series that I'm going to be sharing over the next 2 weeks, because we're going to be getting deeper into 3D form. We're going to be talking a little bit about perspective. And in the final episode, I'm going to be sharing my quick shading method. All right, let's jump in. While we do this warm-up, I'm going to be providing some must-know tips for success that I want you to have in mind as you move forward in your drawing journey. And just as a reminder, I would recommend doing these exercises on a slanted or tilted surface. What I would love for you to do as warm-up is simply fill up a sketchbook page with all sorts of different geometric shapes. Geometric shapes are those which we learn about in math classes early on, such as squares, rectangles, circles, triangles, semicircles, trapezoids, diamonds. For those of you who are not aware, the difference between a shape and a form is that a shape is 2-dimensional and flat, and a form is 3-dimensional and has volume to it. It's made up of different planes. In this third class of the series, we are working on simplifying objects and subject matter into a simple shape or combination of shapes so that we can focus on recreating shape and proportion freehand. And in class number 4, we're going to take it further and we're going to simplify the subject matter that we're observing and drawing into simple forms or combinations of simple forms. Anything that you might decide to draw, from an object to an animal, to a person, to a full scene, can be simplified into basic shapes or forms or combinations of shapes or forms. There are 3 keys to drawing that I want you to have in mind as you move forward with pretty much anything that you try to draw. The first key is to start your drawing lightly, always, and understand that drawing is a refinement process. It's not until you start creating shapes and laying down lines that you can see if you have errors in proportion, perspective, etc. The second key to drawing is to always work large to small or general toward specific. Learn to tune out those small details in the beginning of the process because they don't matter. If you start focusing on details and textures too soon without developing a solid foundation to build on, your drawing is going to fall apart. Not to mention, working large to small is going to allow you to better utilize your drawing space. And finally, the third key to drawing, which is what we're focusing on in this class, is to simplify our subject matter into basic shapes or forms. Working large to small and visualizing things as simple shapes or forms is key if we're wanting to better recreate shapes and proportions and later on perspective when we're drawing freehand. No amount of shading or texture or detail is going to fix a faulty foundation. So if you want to get great at drawing anything freehand in a believable way, it's essential to prioritize the beginning of the process, the block-in, the creation of a successful preliminary sketch. This skill is not developed by spending hours on end shading something or developing high levels of detail in one single drawing. It's by creating many drawings again and again and focusing on the first part of that drawing process. Now, I want you to look around you and just pick an object. Now ask yourself, if I were to simplify this object into a simple shape, a rectangle, a circle, a square, a triangle, or a combination of these, what would those shapes be? For this type of flower vase, for example, which is more like a bucket, it's more like a trapezoid shape. And for this other kind of vase, maybe it's a smushed circle or oval with a trapezoid shape on top, and you can visualize the handle initially as a semicircle. Look at that coffee table over there. It's just a combination of rectangles that, when seen from a certain perspective, end up looking like different kinds of shapes. And yes, sometimes objects have irregularity within that shape, or you'll have to cut off a section of the shape. But starting by laying down that shape in its simplest form is a great place to get started, and then you can refine later. And by the way, there is no wrong answer. You can decide to simplify into whatever shapes are helpful for you. Maybe you see a triangle where I see a trapezoid, or maybe you decide to simplify a section into 2 shapes and I simplify it into 3 shapes. There is no one way to do things. We're going to be starting out with a coffee mug. When I see this coffee mug, the first shape that comes to mind is a trapezoid. So here I'm starting my drawing lightly. I'm using a B pencil, by the way, but I would recommend using an HB so that your drawing is light in the beginning and you can erase mistakes easily. So what I do is I create a trapezoid shape while observing that reference photo and trying to get in that height to width relationship as best as possible freehand. And it all comes down to doing the best that you can initially and then constantly comparing your sketch with the reference photo and continuing to ask yourself, does this look too wide? Does it look too tall? And then continue making any necessary changes as you go until proportions look close to those in the photo. I always make sure to start with the largest part or shape that I see, and then I add to that. So for this one, I then added the handle, which you can decide to simplify into a semicircle first before actually drawing the handle shape and refining it more so that it looks like what you see in the photo there. I always like getting started with the outer silhouette or outer contour shape created by the handle, and then I break up that shape into the different planes that I'm able to see. And the plane changes in handles can be hard because they are curved. It's not flat planes that we're seeing. And there's always this twist where the upper plane turns into the side plane and we see a little bit of the underneath plane. We're going to get more into planes and 3D forms in our next class, but for now, just do the best that you can. And I will be linking to another video where you see me draw an espresso cup at different perspectives in case you'd like to check that out. Let's move on to our second object, and these are going to get more and more challenging as we go. For this one, I picked a compound object. So all this means is that instead of having mainly one single shape, this is a combination of several shapes, and this one is hard because bottles, as many man-made objects are, they have symmetry to them. And not only this, but they're also quite tall. They are a lot taller than they are wide. And longer straight lines are definitely more challenging to draw than shorter lines. But something that I would recommend doing is placing a long vertical line right down the middle of your object, like I did here. And that is going to help you with your symmetry. Another thing that you can use for objects like this where you're stacking shapes over each other and they have to be aligned is to use plumb lines. The lines that you're going to see me add to the left and to the right of this bottle are plumb lines. These are simply lines that we use as tools to keep things aligned and symmetrical whenever we need them to be. Not to mention, by laying down these lines, I can more easily visualize the negative space around the upper part of the bottle, which is what I'm filling in right here. And seeing those negative spaces and making sure that those shapes created by those negative spaces are very similar left to right, those are going to help you with that symmetry as well. So oftentimes, it's not only comparing the positive shapes or positive spaces, which are actually the object itself, it's also about observing those negative shapes or spaces around or in between objects. That is also going to help you get your shapes right. Like for example, with the mug that I drew before, the space inside of the handle is a negative shape. And I can compare the negative shape inside of the handle in my drawing to the negative shape in this area in the photo to ensure that those shapes are very similar. And the last important tool that I want to share with you in this part of the video is tick marks. Create tick marks for yourself before committing to larger shapes so that you can visualize the width of that shape and the height of that shape before going ahead and drawing it. If you notice, I'm constantly laying down ticks for myself before creating my larger shapes. Here, I'm just going to be adding a tiny bit of detail before moving on to the next study. All right, getting a little bit more challenging now. We are going to be sketching a sneaker. So I start laying down simple shapes that I'm bringing together to create the overall larger shape of the sneaker. This object is a lot wider than it is tall. I'm always thinking of that height to width relationship. You can ask yourself questions such as, how many times would the height of the shoe fit into the width of the shoe? You can even imagine this object inside of a rectangular box so that you can more easily understand that relationship between the width versus height. Remember that you don't have to use the exact same shapes that I am creating. I would recommend starting to use your own critical thinking skills to think of your own shapes. You could decide to simplify the entire front portion of the shoe into a single triangle, or having a couple of trapezoid-like shapes in the middle portion instead of a triangle and a trapezoid. Once my blocky shapes are looking good to me, I start creating more of an organic shape, trying to replicate the curves that I see in the outer contour of the shoe in the photo. And you're going to notice that sometimes I go a little bit past my initial shapes that I created, and other times I cut into the shapes. You don't have to go by your lines from your initial shapes super precisely. You can always refine as you go. I continue refining those larger shapes until they look good to me, and then I move on to breaking those larger shapes down into medium-sized shapes. Once the medium-sized shapes are in, I then go ahead and move on to the smallest shapes. The more elements or shapes you start adding into your drawing or breaking your larger shapes down into, the more points of comparison you have. So it's totally normal to find errors that you need to fix as you continue adding more elements and shapes into your drawing. You can find that a space is way too large, a space is way too small, a certain element or shape is more to the left or to the right than what you intended it to be. And those are changes and refinements that you continue making along the way. And the more you practice your freehand sketching, the smaller and smaller those mistakes are going to become. All right, so now that we drew a few man-made objects, let's talk about organic objects. How does all of this apply to organic, natural objects which have a lot more asymmetry, imperfection, and irregularity throughout them? Let's start with a simple pear. I am visualizing this pear initially as a combination of a circle or an oval at the bottom and a triangle or trapezoid at the top. Once I have those two simple shapes in, I start actually building the silhouette shape with small curves and imperfections throughout that I see in that photo right over my shapes. When I draw organic objects, I do my best to create asymmetry and also add some imperfection throughout, because otherwise it may end up looking unnatural. And now let's try to draw an organic object that's a little bit more complex than a simple pear. Let's try to draw a flower now. And I have picked a sunflower, and this particular photo that I chose is showing the sunflower at a bit of an angle. I visualize a simple shape all around the petal area. This would be kind of an oval, but instead of going in and drawing an oval, I make the process of drawing the oval easier for myself by just laying down short connected straight lines, which at the end ends up looking like an oval. Once that exterior oval is in, I then draw two smaller ovals for the central section of that sunflower, which in sunflowers is quite large. You can see how I created those smaller ovals not right in the center of the larger oval, but a bit off center closer to the left. And this is important because I don't want to put that central section right in the middle of the larger oval, because that would not be consistent with the perspective that I'm trying to convey. In sunflowers, that central section is quite large. So I make sure that proportions-wise, the central oval makes sense when I place it inside of the larger oval. I don't want to make it too small and end up with something that doesn't look like a sunflower. So again, it comes down to paying attention to those proportions of that object in the reference Once photo. My larger oval and my smaller ovals are in, it's easier for me to start drawing the petals around the smaller oval, because I now know how large those petals have to be. And the amount of petals and petal shape change from flower to flower. And I have an entire series on how to draw different types of flowers and paying attention to the characteristics of different types of flowers. I'll make sure to link to it down below. When it comes to sunflowers, they have lots of petals. So I go ahead and fill in this space with the number of petals and petal shape that makes sense with this particular kind of flower. I make sure that some of my petal shapes look like they are overlapping over each other so that this looks more realistic. And once that main part of the flower has been drawn, I go ahead and include a stem and the leaves, also simplifying these elements as basic shapes. And finally, let's have a look at how these principles and this method of working large to small, general toward specific, applies for drawing simple nature scenes. My intention here is to show you that the way that you draw one thing is the way that you draw everything. And if you have these principles and these quote-unquote rules in mind and you develop these skills, you're gonna be set to draw pretty much anything that you want. So when it comes to scenes, of course, there are more challenging ones than others. For example, when you're drawing urban scenes with lots of buildings or houses or cars, a deeper understanding of 3D form and perspective comes into play, because you have to understand linear perspective techniques, 1 and 2 point perspective being the most important ones that you should start with. And I will link to classes on 1 and 2 point perspective down below as well, in case you'd like to check those out. But I would still recommend practicing these exercises with flat shapes first, first before moving on to more challenging, complex topics, because this will get you a long way and will help you establish a solid foundation to jump off from. And you'll be able to move on to those more challenging scenes and subject matter with greater ease if you have these skills built first. When it comes to scenes, what's difficult is that you have so many elements. You have elements in the foreground, you have elements in the middle ground, and you have elements in the background. And what's most important is to understand what is overlapping what and what is closest to us as the viewers of the scene, and what is creating the largest shapes, the largest areas. And you start with those largest shapes, and then you place the medium-sized elements and the smallest elements on top. When it comes to the trees, you saw a moment ago how I created simple triangular shapes, and then until I was happy with the number of trees, the size of the trees, and their location, I then created more irregularity along those edges to make them look more like trees. You can see how I left the smallest elements and the mark making techniques for the grass textures, etc., for the very end. And finally, let's look at this second scene. And in this one, we actually see a human figure. And I also have a couple of videos where I explain how to simplify figures into basic shapes, taking into account the major body masses, the head, the torso, and the lower body or the legs, which I'll make sure to link to down below. But this goes to show that everything can be simplified into basic shapes. When it comes to landscapes and scenes, I usually like getting started with the horizon line, which is your eye level as the viewer of the scene. And it's that horizontal line that divides the ground from the sky, or in the case of seascapes, the ocean from the sky. And in this one, the horizon line is easily visible. In the first scene, it wasn't, because it's a hilly area and we see that diagonal for the ground line, so that's why I created that diagonal first. But whenever I do see the horizon line, that is where I start when I'm drawing scenes. I've simplified the little boat and the mountains and even the rocks as basic blocky shapes that I've created by bringing together a series of straight lines. And even though the objective of this third class is not to shade or develop values, I am sharing some of my quick shading process here in these last few sketches so that you can get an idea of what is coming up in class number 5. I'll talk more about my quick shading process in that class, but the objective with these exercises in this one is to focus on shapes, on proportions, on location of shapes in that picture plane. I want you to focus on your block-in, on the creation of your preliminary sketch, and not so much the shading right now. But of course, if you're a little bit more advanced and you want to bring in a little bit of shading into your sketches, that is okay to do as well. Once you've followed along with me in this video, I would highly recommend working through these again on your own and using your own critical thinking skills to think of what shapes to bring together for yourself. And if you find these exercises easy, I would recommend starting to draw from life or from direct observation. So simply take objects that you have around you at home, place them in front of you, and bring to mind everything that I've shared with you today to draw those objects. All right, everyone, and that is going to do it for this third class in this Drawing for Beginners series. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you in class number 4.